This is a Honda Trail 125, and while it's a ton of fun to ride around on the trail and on back roads, when it comes to highway, it's really, really slow. So let's fix that. So what we're installing today is a Yuminashi 143cc big bore kit on the Trail 125. Now, it may seem comical to call 143cc's a big bore, but it's going to give us about a 14% increase in displacement for the Trail 125. Not only is there a larger piston, but it's also a higher compression design piston, so that's going to bump up our power even more. While we have the engine apart, we're going to go ahead and throw in a performance camshaft to help the engine breathe better. As you can see, this one has more lift and duration than the factory cam to push more air through that cylinder head into the bigger bore. So big bore kits for Honda Trail 125s come in a few different flavors. You can get a 143, you can get a 164, and you can get a 181. So why are we going with a 143? Well, every step away from stock you go, you sacrifice some reliability at some level. And with the 164s and the 181s, people are putting aftermarket exhausts, bigger heads, you need a bigger starter, oil pump, oil cooler, a lot of stuff that we really didn't want to put on this because we're keeping the stock exhaust and the stock head and the stock intake. So hopefully the 143 will give us a bump in power and the bigger cam will give us some more RPM range, so if nothing else we can downshift on a hill and still hold speed. So I've got the bike loaded up here on the workbench just to make access easier, and we're going to proceed tearing into everything on the bike. So we're going to disconnect the battery, remove the exhaust, remove the crash bars. This cover is a pain, by the way. Once the exhaust is out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and remove the side cover just to have access to the wiring and any hoses to remove the throttle body. Next, we're going to drain the oil from the crankcase and then remove the oil temperature sensor, which will also drain some oil out, so make sure you drain the oil first. And then we're going to remove two engine plugs, one for the timing location and one for the crank bolt. So the goal here is to rotate the crankshaft to the point that you can see a T mark and line that up with the little notch in the crankcase hole. Here it is straight from the service manual. Align the T mark on the flywheel with the index notch on the left crankcase cover. That T mark is a little hard to see with the camera, but you can clearly see the mark on the crankcase cover here. There's a better shot. Then we're going to take off the cam cover and make sure that the cam is lined up in its top dead center location as well. Once again, straight from the service manual, make sure A and B are lined up, a little circle, and then the notch. And you can see we've got that nailed exactly. Here I'm holding the crank with the ratchet just to keep the cam sprocket from spinning. And then to get the cam sprocket out, you got to drop it kind of down into the head and then remove the chain, and it comes right out. After removing the retaining plate, you can remove the intake and exhaust rocker arm shafts and then get the rocker arms out. By removing a vacuum line, two bolts, and a few plugs, you can get the throttle body detached from the head and then just hold it up out of the way with the bungee cord. The cylinder head is held on with two bolts and four studs. Remove the two bolts first before you remove the studs. After you remove the nuts, there's 3 steel washers, 1 copper washer. Be sure to keep them all. Then the cylinder head will slide right off, followed by the head gasket. The timing chain is guided by a roller that pivots on this bolt. Take out the bolt and you can remove the roller. And the cylinder should slide right off the studs then. Be careful and don't let the piston drop and damage anything. Stuffing a rag or paper towel around the connecting rod will keep stuff out of the engine case and keep the piston from bouncing around while you work on it. The cylinder base gasket is paper, so go ahead and remove it carefully with a razor blade or other scraper. Carefully remove one of the piston pin retaining clips. This one gets launched into outer space, so safety glasses are always a good idea. With the retaining clip or snap ring removed, the piston pin will push out easily from one side to the other, and then the piston's free. The Yuminashi big bore kit came with a full set of piston rings and fresh gaskets. Before I install the piston, I want to check the ring end gap, and there's no specifications that come with the Yuminashi kit, and the Honda Trail 125 manual doesn't have any either, but it's pretty common to see 4 thousandths per inch of bore or ring gap. And so we're going to see what we've got here. All right, 12 is pretty snug. So looks like we've got around 11 to 12 thousandths of end gap clearance. which, you know, it's better to have too much than too little, because when the piston heats up, you don't want those two ends touching and then actually binding the piston in the bore. So 11 thousandths on a 2.2 inch bore should be adequate. So let's go ahead and check the second ring also. Like the second ring is a lot tighter. So that one's about 7 thousandths of an inch. So that one I'm probably going to file just to open it up a little bit. All right, so after some filing, we've got it to 11 thou passing freely, which pretty much matches the number 1 ring, which is what we want. After coating all the rings with oil, we're going to install them, starting with the oil ring spacer, then the lower oil ring, then the top oil ring, then compression ring number 2, the lower of the two, finally number 1, or the top ring. Now all the rings have a specific orientation for their gap. It's listed in the manual. Make sure you follow it. And then we're going to put in a piston retaining ring on one side of the piston and make sure the gap is not aligned with the notch. If any of the cylinder alignment sleeves came off with the old cylinder, remove them and put them in the engine case to hold the gasket and align it, make sure it doesn't get pinched. I've already wiped down the sealing surface with some acetone, but I'm going to wipe it down one more spot where the timing chain has been resting on it, just to make sure there's a good seal. Now it's time to install the piston, and we're going to start with the wrist pin partially installed on the piston, aligning it with the connecting rod, and it should slide right through. Then we need to install a retaining clip on the other side, and once again make sure that the gap in the retaining clip is not lined up with the gap in the piston. So we'll have to rotate it here, as you can see. Now it's time to put on the new cylinder, and this can be one of the most critical and tricky parts of the assembly. Each of the piston rings need to be compressed properly to get into the cylinder bore without binding, and they need to maintain their specific orientation as outlined in the manual. Take your time, don't get in a rush. Once again, make sure they all slide in there nice and easily, no binding, don't pinch anything, don't break anything. Carefully remove the paper towel or rag that you had stuffed in the engine case without tearing the gasket, then fish the timing chain through the cylinder and then seat it down on its base gasket firmly. Now we can reinstall the timing chain guide roller just the opposite way of us removing it. There's also 2 alignment sleeves for the head, make sure those get transferred over properly, and then carefully install the head gasket onto the cylinder studs and alignment sleeves. After a thorough cleaning of the cylinder head gasket surface, we're going to go ahead and install the cylinder head by sliding it over the studs and fishing through the timing chain. The timing chain can be a challenge, so an extra hand, or in this case a finger, helps out a lot. Install the head stud nuts first, torquing them in an X pattern, followed by the bolts. The rocker arms roll on the camshaft, but I figured I'd go ahead and give it a good coating of assembly lube just to make sure it doesn't dry start and rolls freely. I also went ahead and pre-lubed both bearings, once again, just to make sure it doesn't dry start. And the new camshaft just slides right in. One thing to note is this new camshaft does not have a compression release on the exhaust valve, so it may take more force to get it started, especially with the Kickstarter. The rocker arms go back in the same way they came out, so kind of hold it in place and then install a shaft. I threw a little blue Loctite on the retainer bolt, and this retainer plate holds in not only the pivot shafts for the intake and exhaust rocker arms, but also holds in the camshaft bearing itself. If this bolt came loose and this came out, it'd be pretty catastrophic inside the engine. So now we need to remove the cam chain tensioner so we can install the cam chain sprocket and the cam chain. And be careful, because it could end up one tooth off like it is here, and we'll just have to fix that. That's a lot better, look at that, perfect. Now that the cam chain is back in, we can put the cam chain tensioner and spring in. The manual calls for 4 cc's of oil to prime it, but a couple squirts from an oil can works for me. then the cam sprocket can get torqued to spec. Since we installed a new camshaft, we're going to have to reset the valve lash, and the tappet adjusting screws have a weird square head on them. I didn't have a proper wrench, but I found a small tap wrench worked great. After getting the rocker covers reinstalled, we can move on to reinstalling the throttle body. Next, we're going to remove the factory fuel injector and install a larger one. The high pressure line has a locking tab that needs to be pushed down and then it can be removed. A wiring harness and 2 more bolts, and the whole fuel injector and holder can be removed. This is a 170cc injector we're going to install. Also came from Yuminashi. This is recommended for engines in this range. And the fuel injector goes right back in the same way it came out. Don't forget to plug back in the oxygen sensor. I left it attached to the head this whole time just to keep it simple. At this point, it's a really good idea to spin the crank twice, 2 complete revolutions, just to make sure the cam timing is good and make sure the valves don't hit the piston. You want to find this out by hand rather than trying to crank it over and have some valve clearance issues. In my case, had no issues, but like I said, just a good idea to check it. And cranking over by hand, you can really feel the additional compression from the new piston and cylinder. Then we can put the cam cover back on, start reconnecting everything to the throttle body, including the intake hose. Make sure all the sensors are hooked back up, and then put some oil in it just so we don't forget. Okay, so we got the Yuminashi big bore kit installed in the engine and got the larger fuel injector installed in the intake. But to just make sure that it's fueling correctly, I'm going to install a wideband air-fuel ratio gauge. So the Trail 125 is fuel injected, and it does have an oxygen sensor here. But it's only a 1-wire, meaning it's a narrowband oxygen sensor, which means it can really only tell the computer if it's lean or rich from 14.7 to 1. It doesn't really give it a whole bunch of information, doesn't tell it how rich it is or how lean it is. So if we tapped into that and put a gauge up top, it wouldn't give us that much information on how to proceed from tuning. So what we're going to do is we're going to install a wideband air-fuel ratio gauge. This is just going to get installed temporarily. I'll probably end up zip tying it up to the handlebars, and that's it. And then once I've got it tuned where I think it's working great, I will take it off and never put it on again. But to do that, we need to install a Bosch wideband oxygen sensor. And this is quite a bit bigger than the stock oxygen sensor, so it won't fit in the same hole. So we're going to have to add a bung into the exhaust. It's pretty tight in here with the skid plate installed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install a bung in the exhaust, screw this in with no skid plate. Then I'll ride around to get it tuned up. Once I'm comfortable with it, once again, this is coming out and this won't stay in there. I'll just put a plug in the exhaust and the bung can just live in there. This is a gauge I already had lying around, came out of my Lotus 7 replica. It'll go back in that when I'm done. So to make a bung for this to fit the exhaust, what we're going to have to do is we're going to take a standard oxygen sensor bung, which these just come from the auto parts store. It's basically just an M18 nut. And then we're going to make a little bit of a tube extension because this is big enough it would block pretty much the entire exhaust. So we're going to go over and do that. If you're curious about my tube notching process, check out my previous video where I build the crash bars. I go really in depth on that. To hold the extension tube onto the bung while I weld it, I'm going to use a 5/8 nut, and then I'm going to TIG weld it in place all the way around. Next up, I got to mark the tube where I want to drill the hole and mount it. So I'm just going to basically eyeball it and then mark it with a welding pencil. Once it's marked, I'm going to drill a hole and then deburr it by hand with a file just to make sure there's no sharp burrs that can fall off into the exhaust and clog the muffler or catalytic converter. Clean it up, and some more welding. So the wideband oxygen sensor has a lot of wiring because it's a gauge I use in a different car. And this is all just zip tied up here temporarily. None of this is permanent. I 3D printed a gauge pod to hold it up to the handlebar, so when I'm riding around and tuning it, I can see the air-fuel ratio. This just zip ties up here, and my wiring, literally I have some disconnects here that I will connect, and that's how it turns on. Once again, this is just temporary. I mean, this is speaker wire wired into the battery. Nothing intended to be permanent here. But now that it's all back together, and we've got the larger 170cc injector installed in the intake, it's time to fire it up and see if it runs. So let's do that. All right, so the wideband oxygen sensor takes a little bit for it to warm up. It's alive now, and as you can see, it's running pretty rich at 10.7. And it runs really rich right now. See what it adjusts back to if it settles out. All right, so I rode the bike around in the dark a little bit and got it warmed up, and now that it's up to temperature, it's idling very lean, where I think it would be for a fuel injected bike. So basically at perfect stoichiometric mixture, and then when I give it some throttle, it gets richer from there. So pulling the hill in the backyard, it's still dropping to around 10 to 11, which is still pretty rich. We'll see how that does on the street on a longer stretch. But right now, it goes up the hill, spins the tire much more easily. So road test next. Well, unfortunately, the road test did not go as well as I had hoped. I think the fuel injector I bought is too large. This is the 170cc, and the bike runs really, really rich under load at full throttle. I mean, we're talking in the 9s and 10s. I really hate to end this episode this way, but I really don't have a choice at this point. The bike's not finished yet, so I'm going to have to order some more parts and come back. So be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next episode, where we're going to go through tuning this bike and getting it up and running and maximizing the potential of this big bore kit. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.